All interviews presented on the Remedy Revolution podcast are designed to provide information and inspiration only. Guests of the podcast may present opinions and anecdotes which are solely their own. And as always, before beginning any treatment protocol, please consult with your preferred medical provider. Welcome to the Remedy Revolution podcast. My name is Erin, and today's episode is going to be a little bit different. So, seasoned listeners may or may not know, but this podcast was actually born a couple of years ago out of frustration. So, there were countless doctors that I knew who were being censored and silenced and even threatened despite their own clinical experience as well as their research expertise. And for those of you who know or have listened to the podcast in the past, you may know that myself, as well as my son, really struggled to find doctors who were willing or capable of taking our cases. We both had struggled greatly with neuroimmune disorders and Lyme disease. And so I knew that if those doctors were being censored, that many other people who were seeking out treatment would slip through the cracks and they might never find the treatments that they actually needed. I had observed a lot of this, obviously, for many years, and really the amplification became glaringly obvious during the COVID years. Um, but I guess before I get into that, I just want to tell you a little bit of a story. And I think this will make sense as we get a little further along. When my son was first diagnosed with a neuroimmune disorder called PANS about 12 years ago, I was really searching high and low for doctors who could help give him the care that he needed. And during that process, I spent thousands upon thousands of dollars. I had many, many sleepless nights researching, trying to figure out what I possibly could about his disorder and how I might be able to assist him. And during that time, I wound up, probably because of lack of sleep, becoming very ill myself. And then I encountered the same exact thing. Many doctors who perhaps even wanted to help, but were simply unable to. I don't really know how to describe the amount of frustration and despair that you feel when you are simply praying for one normal day. You know, one day without feeling sick or feeling tired or having intense amounts of pain. And then to be met with things like, oh, well, you already actually know more than I do. Or, I'm really sorry, but I'm just not able to help. Or the worst part, it would be when, you'd get there, you'd have so much hope, walk into a doctor's office, and they'd give you this, laundry list of things that you needed to take starting yesterday. And then you wind up in the exact same place after doing all of the work, except with a lot less money in your bank account. Um, to say that I was frustrated by the medical system would be probably the understatement of the century. At that time, I started an online support group for moms, and many of those moms were looking for the same answers that I was. And I found that many of them shared the exact same frustrations. We collaborated, into the evening. But we were all on a mission to save our kids, and anything that we tried, be it some kind of random Hail Mary, um most of us really tried to do all of those things together. We weren't going to stop at anything to make sure that we healed our kids. At that time, I started learning a lot about many of the kids in that group who had been triggered into this illness after receiving vaccines. And then the first doctor that I went to brought my son in, clearly stated to me, thank God you did not vaccinate this child, because he clearly has some immune deficiencies and he would have been very, very severely autistic had you given him those vaccines. And that obviously that's controversy that, we could talk about at another time, but essentially it confirmed some of the fears that I had had as a mom, right? At that time, in my home state of California, they were attempting to pass SB 277. And that was a bill that would take away the philosophical vaccine exemptions for school children. And even though at that time my son was not attending school, nor was he able to, I knew that if he ever wanted to, that this would be a hurdle that we would have to overcome. And so I became involved. I started writing to my legislators, trying to speak with them. I joined various groups throughout the state. doing whatever I could, primarily from home because my son was homebound at that time. And, reasonably at that point in time, I believe that, I would need to start with the Democrats, primarily because I was in California. So most of my representatives were actually Democrats. But I actually felt like, if anybody would care about a situation like this, then it would be the Democratic Party, based on, my experience of what I knew about the Democrats. And I'll go into that in a little bit also. But um, I was shocked that I did not receive hardly any meaningful responses. I did get one reply from somebody I had actually previously voted for, stating that she had already made up her mind and she would be passing the bill. And I think at that point in time, I was still really stunned. I felt a little bit disenfranchised, but certainly I still felt like this in principle should be an issue that the Democrats would be interested in. Um, but sadly, they weren't. SB 277 passed, and then I kind of let that go and just focused on my son's health. And not long after that, the state of California, Senator Richard Pan there introduced SB 276. Now, that bill was to severely restrict the remaining medical exemption within the state. So even though 277 had passed, I still felt like, okay, well, there's a medical exemption, and my son would probably qualify given all of the issues that he's had, health issues that he's had, for a medical exemption. But when this bill was introduced, I started to question that, obviously, and question the motives truly of, why was it now that they were going after the medical exemption? It, when the entire argument had centered around, well, the state of California does still offer medical exemptions, so clearly those who are immune compromised, will be protected. But SB 276 was going to allow each doctor to only write 6 medical exemptions per year. That's, to my understanding at this point, how it still is, though I could be incorrect. Anybody can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong on that number. But the problem was that the doctors who were writing those exemptions would then be scrutinized by the California Medical Board and heavily threatened with the loss of their licenses for merely writing what they were now legally allowed to write. Um, and then how do we navigate this whole idea of, children's health records being opened to some state advisory board, versus kept private via HIPAA through, patient-doctor relationships? Why would we have to, you know, give the state all of that information? It really seemed to me like a huge overreach. Um, but again, SB 276 was passed. At that point in the state of California, most doctors were unwilling then to even write a medical exemption because they were under so much scrutiny and the threat of losing their livelihood, which I can certainly understand. Um, Again, I think, at that point, I really tried to be open-minded about who might listen, particularly with SB 276, because we were talking about children who were already immune compromised. So certainly the Democrats would care about those children and, making sure that they were still protected. Um, but, unfortunately, that wasn't what happened. And simultaneously, there was another bill that was introduced called AB 262. And I've mentioned this bill in the podcast in the past. That's because it really contains something that I found very concerning. That particular bill gave unlimited power to local public health authorities to do whatever they saw fit during any outbreak. So many of the arguments during 277 and 276 were that, things like the measles outbreak at Disneyland and all of these kinds of things were a severe threat to public health, and that it was the unvaccinated who were perpetuating these kinds of outbreaks. We know, however, that that's not the case. That even in the Disneyland case, that patient zero was a vaccinated individual. That's the case with pertussis, for example. Pertussis is spread via vaccination. The strain that is spread is only vaccine strain pertussis at this point. So we know, and we knew at that point, that all of these outbreaks were being driven by the vaccinated. However, that detail was ignored, and the people who were trying to explain that information were completely gaslit throughout all of this. But anyway, AB 262 was going to allow the public health department to first secure the names and the information of all these children who had exemptions, because now they were monitoring these medical exemptions through the state of California. And then they were going to be able to go after people via the public health department in the case of an outbreak. So I think ultimately, I'm of the belief that I don't believe that any of these pieces of legislation are being passed and pushed without the intention of using them. That made me very uneasy. This idea that should I be able to secure a medical exemption by the grace of God, because it was now very difficult in the state of California in order to allow my son to go to school, then I would open myself up and my family up to extreme scrutiny and perhaps even forcibly, you know, somehow doing something to my child if there happened to be an outbreak in our area. So I wanted to mention kind of a little bit more about my own history. So, gosh, it was in I guess 2010 that I wrote a book called Mind Over Fat, or The Secret to Thinking Yourself Thin. And at that time, I had done a ton of research into things like the chemicalization of, our foods. I knew all the stories about Monsanto and their genetically engineered seeds, the way that they were introducing all of these pesticides and herbicides, and creating this system, really an incestuous system, with the farms around the nation that did not allow for autonomy for the small family farms, because they had these seeds which would terminate. Essentially, they weren't able to regerminate, as seeds have, for hundreds of thousands of millions of years, perhaps. And it made it so that many of these farmers became so reliant on big chemical giants like Monsanto that they were unable to sustain. And then, they'd get bought out by these big conglomerates. And then, we ended up with the current food system because, these small family farmers just weren't able to make it without, because they'd become so reliant on companies like Monsanto. So I had been to several March Against Monsanto events. I had been an active proponent, an advocate for regenerative farming, regenerative agriculture, regenerative ranching, working in conjunction with our land, purchasing local from small family farms, all of these things that I really believe and still do very strongly in. Um, you know, Watching a lot of that really made me realize how corporate lobbies had really corrupted our government agencies. So I've gone into some of this in previous conversations, but we've talked about things like the fact that our uh, our current system allows the U.S. government to subsidize certain crops, commodity crops, and this is not good for the farmers. It's not good for the health of our people, because this is how we get things like high fructose corn syrup. It's because we have an excess amount of commoditized crops that then, we don't know what to do with. And so we have to create new things, new products, new, Frankenstein foods in order to utilize all of those things, instead of taking it back and understanding like, well, we can grow a wide variety of things, but we're not incentivized to grow those things because the US government is paying us for corn and soy and canola, all of these things that unfortunately are very detrimental to our health. But, and of course, the agencies are on board because they're in bed with Monsanto and all of these other big conglomerates. Um, so that's a little bit of my background. I also attended San Diego Board of Supervisors meetings. I went face to face with Nathan Fletcher. He was the husband of the California Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez. I was trying to stop the installation of these 5G towers across the county. Um, they were attempting to bring into these 5G towers all across the community. They'd never done any human health testing. There was extensive, of course, environmental testing that they had done. However, there was not one single test that would have given us any opportunity even to see if there was going to be a human health impact. And I found that very frightening, to be honest. Um, Mr. Fletcher, who, smirked at me when I was giving my speech. It was uh, very disheartening to see public officials look down on their constituents that way. By the way, he was a lifelong Democrat. He changed his party affiliation. I'm sorry, a lifelong Republican who changed his party affiliation when he couldn't get the nomination for mayor in the county and or in the city. And so it's interesting to know that he was leading the charge against all of us crazy environmentalists as a sitting Democrat. Um, but, I think at that point, it really became very clear to me that the government of California, at minimum, or at least the Democratic leadership, had really been absolutely corrupted by corporate pharmaceutical lobbies, chemical lobbies, big food, big ag, all of these lobbyists who had infiltrated, all of our agencies and gotten to the place where it was getting a little bit scary. So, in December of 2019, I decided that I was going to leave my home state. By the way, I was at least sixth or seventh generation born in the state of California, which is pretty unusual. Um, but I just didn't feel like my son was going to ever be able to attend school, even if he wanted to or didn't want to. But I wanted him to have that choice. I really felt betrayed by my government. I felt betrayed by the people who were supposed to be representing me and my family. And I felt really strongly that something was coming because why else would they have passed all of this legislation if they had zero intention of using it? So we packed up, we moved cross country to Texas. And of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. My intuition was then very much confirmed in a major way. Um, and at that point, if you listen to some of my previous interviews, I had people like Dr. Pierre Corey, Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Jim Meehan, Dr. Paul Thomas. Um, you'll see and you'll understand how the political machine silenced them and countless others for simply sharing the truth about things like ivermectin and vitamin C and masks and the dangers of experimental vaccines. All of this was going on during the COVID years, but really it had been going on prior to all of that. I think the amplification was just so incredible that people started to take notice. But again, this pattern emerged. And because of censorship and the calls for lockdowns and the totalitarian closures of businesses and of schools and the narrative against those people who did not comply was really almost entirely perpetuated by one political party. So I think at the point that the Biden administration really began pushing for proof of vaccination in public spaces, when we started to see celebrities who were wishing death upon people who didn't take an experimental medical product, when state governments started running lotteries and contests and giving out ice cream and hamburgers and money, if you showed your vaccine card, people posting on Instagram, photos of themselves with their band-aid on their arm, like it was some badge of honor. Honestly, it felt to me like the real life Hunger Games or The Giver or 1984, take your pick of any kind of dystopian story. It felt like that had come to life because friends and family were disowning me. They called me racist and bigoted and selfish and ignorant. And the craziest part is that during that time, I also became a single mom. And it was a really difficult season of my life. And yet, because of choices that I had made for my body and my child's body, I was really offered little to no support at that time. Um, and then I was kicked out of the bank for not wearing a mask. I was chased down the aisle at the grocery store, screamed at. I was told by a friend that I had to attend a seminar on white privilege if I ever wanted to be in her life or the life of anybody else of color again. Um, I just, that was really incredible to me. But, I think prior to all of this, I guess I just was under the false impression that the health and well-being of our kids, that access to alternative healthcare and the environmental impact on our health, I just felt like all of these issues really should be of particular concern to the left because supposedly they were for the working people, for the little guy, right? For the underdog. But time and time again, I just was proven wrong that like all of these issues were now no longer issues of the Democratic Party. And the strangest part about all of this was that I had not changed, not one bit. And I think most of the people with whom I had any significant relationship with prior to any of this, they knew who I was and what I stood for from the very beginning. From the very beginning. I mean, I wrote that book 14 years ago, but my crime was that I had the courage to say it. It really goes beyond words, and the best thing that I can come up with is surreal. But even that really doesn't go into the depth of the kind of persecution that you feel in that moment when people are abandoning you despite the fact that you've not changed. So, a month or two ago, Senator Ron Johnson invited several thought leaders in the health world to speak in Washington, D.C. And it was a summit to raise awareness about the abysmal state of health in our country. And if you have the chance to watch it, I'll link it below. If I forget to do that, somebody make a comment, please, and remind me. But it's highly worth the 3 to 4 hours. It's lengthy, of course, but you can break it up because the actual speeches are only maybe 10, 15 minutes. But even at this roundtable that really should have involved every single government representative, regardless of any political leaning, any affiliation, it doesn't matter. Shouldn't health, prevention of horrible diseases be nonpartisan? And then again, Vani Hari, she's known as the food babe. She's been followed her for many, many years, but she brought over 400,000 signatures to the door of Kellogg's. She wanted to protest the food dyes and the BHT in their products that are marketed in the United States because they market these same products overseas without those ingredients. So, how is it that we are exporting healthier versions and we save the poisonous stuff for our own kids? And then when Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who played an enormous role in the march against Monsanto, so, I'd followed him for many years because of all of that. He won a $290 million case against, the chemical giant Monsanto. Look that up too. That was a really groundbreaking case, which proved that Monsanto was causing cancer. Um, he attempted to run a campaign as a Democrat. And he also found out the hard way that the Democrats were going to foil his efforts at every single turn. They outlawed him from campaigning in New Hampshire. They refused interviews. Well, let me just kind of give you an idea of exactly what happened in New Hampshire. They outlawed him from campaigning in New Hampshire because if he did, they would take all of the electorate votes in the primaries that were going to Biden going to RFK, and they would give them to Biden. They refused him interviews on the legacy media. They excluded him and as well as others, Jill Stein, who I, by the way, voted for in 2016, from the debates, and they installed Kamala Harris without a primary. So the crazy thing to me was the irony of installing a candidate and then running a campaign based on saving democracy when they had completely circumvented the democratic process in order to put her there in the first place. So when Kennedy was forced to end his campaign largely due to all these nefarious practices of the Democratic Party, something that he said really stuck out to me. He said, "We need to love our kids more than we hate each other." And he then went on to urge Americans to vote for Donald Trump because that would secure him a spot in order to continue his mission, and also included a ticket with Democrats, former Democrats like Tulsi Gabbard, who I followed for years, who I think would be an amazing female president. uh, Tulsi 2028, I guess, Vivek Ramaswamy and JD Vance and even Elon Musk. But all of these people spoke about ideas and innovation, and they talked about dismantling the corruption, dismantling the collusion between agency and corporate interests and government, and how this whole incestuous system was, you know, pushing on like a machine. And then meanwhile, Kamala Harris had rappers twerking and Beyonce and J-Lo giving these really vapid speeches and countless actors telling me that what I was witnessing was definitely a mirage and that, oh, well, should I dare to choose the other team, I was most assuredly a Nazi and a bigot and a racist and anti-LGBTQ and a misogynist and of course against all women. But I don't think I will ever comprehend how hateful rhetoric coming from the left is somehow acceptable. I mean, I remember a time when Kathy Griffin held a bloody head of President Trump, and people were celebrating this right to free speech. And I remember a time when Kimmel told the unvaccinated that they should be turned away from the ICU to rest in peace, Wheezy. And I remember a time when our now president-elect took a bullet in the air, and social media and celebrities alike blamed the shooter for missing the shot. How have we come so far? How have we become so divided and hateful? How have we turned discussions about health that were once an issue that nearly everyone could rally behind into these highly charged political talking points? How is it that asking Kellogg's to make higher quality food for our kids, all of our kids, is somehow now a Republican issue? I mean, I didn't know that children had political affiliations. I mean, mine certainly didn't. But I firmly believe that the new administration will work tirelessly to shift the health of our nation. And this is why myself and many others have made their choice. But should they stray from that mission, it's not in my nature to defend them. It's not. I will fight for what's right. And regardless of where you stand politically, can we please return to the basics of our shared interest in health, no matter who is championing the fight? Can we please return to the basics of our shared interest in health, no matter who is championing the fight? Can we get back to understanding that health is truly the foundation of humanity itself? More than 40% of our nation is obese. More than 45 million Americans are on SSRIs. Nearly $7 billion is advocated towards cancer research, and cancer rates continue to rise year after year. The bottom line is we are spending more on healthcare than ever before, while our outcomes are in a steady decline. We spend more than double per year per person in the US than in any other nation on healthcare. And yet, our doctors still aren't trained in true preventative care, in nutrition, or alternative treatments. Can we please sit together at the table and drop the politics for just a moment? Can we, as RFK Jr. so eloquently stated, love our children more than we hate each other? Please join me in helping to make America healthy again together. Thank you all. Take care.
With hope as a guiding light, through darkest days we'll fight the night. With a whole lot of passion, with a whole lot of truth, Remedy Revolution is here for you.